Welcome to another episode of Behind the Veil, where we discuss subjects of high strangeness and things that challenge what we know of reality. I'm your host, Mike Hughes.
And I'm your co-host, Christian Julian. And today we have a special guest, Esoteric Eddie, and we're going to be going over Paleocontact of ancient civilizations. So, Mike, can you kind of go into like a little bit of what that means?
Absolutely. Paleocontact, aka is the ancient astronaut theory. It is a term that came into usage to describe a hypothesis that intelligent extraterrestrial beings have visited Earth in the past and have interacted with humanity. And I am super excited to have this conversation because this is something that has always intrigued me ever since I was a kid. And our very special guest, Esoteric Eddie, is somebody who I've been following, and I think this man has really done his homework on this subject, and I think he can really bring some amazing information to this subject matter. Eddie, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, what's up? What's up? Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we're glad to
Namaste.
have you.
So the big thing for me is like I really, if you could, can you tell our listeners and viewers who you are, and really what sparked your curiosity about ancient cultures that led you down this path of seeking knowledge and truth about who we are and what our possible origins are?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, I'm Eddie. I go by Esoteric Eddie online. But I've been researching the occult, conspiratorial, the esoteric for about 15 years now.
Wow.
And I've had many different incarnations as an artist throughout my life. And throughout those different incarnations as an artist, all of my work has always revolved these subjects. But more recently, I've published 3 books within the past 2 years and have released, I don't know, close to like 100, maybe over 100 now, 100 videos on my YouTube channel. Some of those being full length, 1 hour plus documentaries on these subjects as well. And so I've just been putting in the work the past couple years with the Esoteric Eddie brand. But prior to that, my entire life has pretty much revolved this stuff through different experiences and different pursuits, and it goes all the way back to until I was a kid. Really, some of my earliest memories were memories of being fascinated with the stories from the Bible, and fascinated with stories of coming out of legendary history. And so, and I've coupled with that all throughout my young life. I've had experiences and conversations with people about this kind of stuff that's continued me on this journey.
You know, the big thing for me was when I was a kid, I grew up in a semi-religious family, depends on what side of the family I was hanging out with. They were either really not religious or they were extremely religious. But, as a kid, I was super curious and I would hear, things in the Bible and think about God. And I always asked that question, or I always interpreted it differently as a child. And I kept thinking to myself that, this almost seems like they're interacting some of these Bible terms and dialogue in it. Seems like they're almost interacting with not really a God, so to speak, but a being, or even beings, being plural. It's just something that always kind of haunted me, and I never really had was never really able to share that kind of thought and curiosity with people growing up. It wasn't really even a really acceptable kind of thing to think about. But as I've gotten older, I've dug into it deeper, and personally, to me, it does seem like that we were possibly dealing with not necessarily a god, or you could say gods. But it did seem like there was a possible extraterrestrial connection within the Bible and other ancient texts. How did you start connecting some of the dots on that?
Well, everything kind of came together around the time I was like 13 and 14. So prior to that, I was already curious and already kind of questioning authority and questioning history due to my experiences and studies. But right around 13, 14 years of age, which was like 2006-ish for me, around then. No, sorry, like 2009-ish, around then. Right around that time, I started getting into cannabis, started getting into psychedelics, and was listening to certain hip hop music that was talking about this stuff. And so I was like hearing these subjects on through these songs, and was always questioning, what are these guys talking about? So it kind of led me down research, and eventually it all kind of just really started to make sense when I first read the works of Zechariah Sitchin. So when I started reading Zechariah Sitchin's books back in like freshman year of high school, that's when it all connected. And I was like, okay, these are the answers that I'd been looking for. And although I don't agree with everything that he says now, after going through all of this for many many years, but that moment, from being all the way up until 14 years old and reading his books for the first time, that's when it really started to make sense. And so I started to do my own kind of research and look at these things through my own critical mind. But his work was like the basis for me into understanding the connection between the Bible, ancient religions, ancient history, and the supposed ancient alien theory.
And Christian, you're a religious guy. What are your thoughts on the possibilities of this? I mean, you're a man of faith. Has these ideas ever crossed your mind?
Um, Not particularly. I find them really interesting. I'm not kind of one of those that's just like going to immediately shut out these ideas. I just like listening to people's different opinions and kind of their truths of the world. Um, there's definitely talks of other gods back, especially in the Old Testament. When the Jews left Egypt, they really ran into that problem of like constantly worshiping. I think his name Baal, the god Baal. Um, so there's definitely these other ideas out there during these times of these different gods or beings. So that's like one reason why I'm pretty like curious to like hear about this. And yeah, I mean, no, I never let it like it never like greatly challenged my faith or anything, but I find it really interesting, kind of the history of all this and kind of how these civilizations, experience these things or they said they did. Um, and just listening, Eddie, I listened to one of your videos and it was pretty amazing that you kind of have spent so much time researching all this. And I was just kind of wondering, I have a couple questions. Like with all that time you spent, do you have a background or like a degree or anything in like history or Near Eastern cultures or anything like that?
Oh man, I am a college dropout.
Okay.
But the thing is, I was actually going to school to be a history teacher. I
Yeah.
wanted to be a history teacher. I was mostly influenced from my mom. She was a teacher for 10 plus years, and I've always loved history. I've always loved educating in general. So I was
Hmm.
going to school for that. And my goal was I wanted to actually be the first San Diego professor to teach the ancient alien theory. And that's still a goal that would be cool to achieve someday.
Definitely.
But I was going to school, and then I hit one of the lowest, probably the lowest point, hopefully the lowest point of my life, and in my early 20s. And so I just walked out from school, and but it's a whole different story. But I'm glad I did, because now I'm still reaching thousands of people, and still teaching them, all the stuff that I would have wanted to teach. And if had I gone through the institution, I probably would have been way more constricted and limited at what I could have taught, people.
Yeah, you probably felt like they would have confined those ideas, and yeah, and I get it. College can be it can be difficult, especially if you kind of don't have a set goal from the beginning. And but I could tell just by listening, like you really did your research. This isn't just like something you came up with out of nowhere. And I just find that really intriguing. But
Oh
and
yeah.
then your kind of going into what you said. Now you talked about your use of psychedelics at a young age. Like, what were some of those experiences you had? Like, did you feel like those kind of experiences like opened up your consciousness or kind of expanded your mind into thinking and kind of exploring these ideas more?
Yeah, I've always been a heady kind of person. I've
Hmm.
always been very imaginative and artistic and stuff like that. Like I started writing when I was in elementary. I wrote a bunch of fictional stories as a kid. So my writing passion has always been there. My imaginative passion has always been there. And so when I started smoking cannabis and doing psychedelic mushrooms, it just expanded that to an extreme, and that's one thing. But the other thing is like being able to have those experiences as a young person, it just completely revamped me and made me realize that this life was way more fascinating and complex than the mundane mainstream global institution was trying to make us believe that it is. So if anything, what psychedelics and psychoactive drugs did for me as a kid, if any benefit at all towards my research, was just making me really realize that there was so much more to this life than what the TV is going to tell us.
Yeah,
Amen to that.
yeah, and when I first watched your video, I think it was the Concrete podcast that I would listen to. Uh, that was an awesome video. Really well produced. Kudos to you and that guy. But kind of this was really the first time that I've ever looked into these beings called the Anunnaki, and that's kind of like your main focus for today, I think. And I never heard about them before, but from what I understand, this was a group of deities, or is it, yeah, a group of deities that the
Sumerians.
Babylonians, and they kind of worshipped them during that time, correct? Back in around like 4000 BC.
Oh yeah, absolutely, man. Yeah, so we can definitely get into it, and I touch on this in my book, The Anunnaki Theorem, and there's a free documentary version of it on my YouTube channel for anybody that wants to watch it. But yeah, I mean, we can get into it. So, oh man, so where do we start? So, of course, as of right now, right, uh, we live in this current timeline, what I call the current timeline of 7,000 years. That's what they say. But we know that the timeline of human history is way older than that, because we have sites like Gobekli Tepe that are like 9 to 14,000 years old. But the current timeline, the accepted timeline, it starts with the Sumerian civilization about 4 to 5,000 BC up until now, so about 7,000 years. And for the first few thousand years prior to Judaism, our ancestors over there in the Middle East worshipped these beings called the Anunnaki. And that is attested by all of their texts, all of their religious texts, factual clay tablets. And so through the transition of these original civilizations, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, came Judaism. And Judaism was a small up and coming, a religion, founded by the ethnic group of the Jews, and they were small time, but of course, history would eventually make them big time as all these other ancient kingdoms faded away. But as they faded away, the early Israelites, the early Jews, they were influenced by these kingdoms and these people because they were their direct ancestors. And so Judaism, the Torah, the Old Testament was heavily influenced by these first few thousand years of our current timeline, our entire history of the timeline we exist in. And then from there, Judaism was formed. And then later on, the Christians, the early Christian writers, the early Christian people or philosophers, they took the Torah, which was already which was a book that was already majorly influenced by all of these thousands of years, and kind of dismissed all of that historical context of the Anunnaki and just try to take apart what the Torah was saying for face value. And by doing that, they kind of misunderstood and mistranslated a lot of that early influence.
Why do you think that is, or do you think they did that on purpose?
I think there could be some nefarious agendas,
Hmm.
specifically with like the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah.
But honestly, a lot of it, after doing all the research that I've done, a lot of it was just due to human error. And it's just kind of a thing we tend to do as people is we try to just simplify and overgeneralize things and exaggerate.
Yeah.
That's I find that happening a lot as I research things.
Well, and there's also a lot of terms and usage in the Bible that, for example, one of my favorite ones is it said, and God said, "Let us make man in our image, not my image." Let me rephrase that again. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish in the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." So it's little things like that when I would hear that, and that's a big one in kind of the ancient astronaut theory stuff, paleocontact, is when you hear phrases like that, when they're clearly, it's not speaking in singular, it's saying our, meaning more than one. And Eddie was spot on with a lot of terms in the Bible have their meaning has been changed to fit a particular narrative. Monotheism, I think, really kind of was crafted into the Bible to simplify it, and also I think a lot of the stuff, the Bible and whichever version you're reading has been hand molded throughout time to fit particular narratives. And there's a lot of stuff within the Bible that's original stuff that is not the kind of godly material that one would think of like a peaceful, benevolent God. A lot of it is vicious. A lot of it is cruel. So when you get into a lot of that kind of stuff, it makes you wonder, like, how did we get from that version of religion to this other version of religion? And it seems like it's really a historical timeline of where it almost seems like you're dealing with someone with bipolar, so to speak, that's different attitudes depending on where you're at. And a lot of people these days have really done their homework, and there's a lot of biblical scholars, which I'm super impressed about. And that's really what's kind of given some of this validity to me, is that it's not, street scholars like myself digging into it, but there's amazing people like Paul Wallace, who's part of the church for a very long time, biblical scholar. And him and another man from Italy, I forget the guy's name in particular, but
It's Mauro Biglino.
that is him. Bravo, sir. He is well, why don't you tell me about who he is and the type of work he's done?
Yeah, so Mauro Biglino, he used to work for a company that was partnered with the Vatican. And so the Vatican used to employ them to translate ancient texts for them. So they were basically translators for the Vatican. And so Mauro Biglino started translating a lot of this ancient stuff and realized that the Bible, the original versions of the Torah, were basically influenced by the Sumerian tablets, and that they were speaking about the Sumerian gods. And so he kind of like changed his entire thinking on all of this and realized that the writers of the Torah were really kind of revamping and reimagining the Sumerian myths. And again, that makes sense because the writers of the Torah, the writers of the Old Testament, were directly connected to these people because the Sumerians were their ancestors. It's us and, the early Christian writers who took the Torah and completely dismissed all of those thousands of years of historical context.
And and he is such a professional in what he's done, and he's been someone highly respected in that field, translating Hebrew accurate terms for the Vatican. So when you have a man of that caliber and Paul Wallace combined, teaming up to bring this kind of information forward, is extremely powerful and extremely controversial on that. It wasn't like they were winning any points with the Vatican or the church by bringing this kind of information to light. And one thing I would really like to make clear is I don't think this is any negative thing or trying to diminish religion in any way. I think really what it is this conversation is very important to have, because I think it is an expansion of what we know. It is just another chapter in human history that we're able to open these pages up and take a look back and try to redefine what it is exactly that they're telling us. And I know that a lot of times these kind of conversations can be difficult to have, because one of my biggest issues when I was growing up or in church is that it didn't really feel like it was, I kind of felt like religion was put into a box, and that there really wasn't much room for outside growth or trying to, hey, what did they really mean by that? It was basically, this is what it is, don't question it and go by it, and that alone is faith. And for me, that always kind of bothered me, because I think my natural curiosity of how I think, I always question that. And I think that that was complimenting it for what it is. And when you hear, you have to realize that they were explaining things at a point in time in humanity when they had no other way to describe things. And I think that they were articulating things the best they could. But you know, when you get into other ancient texts like the Sumerians and stuff like that, I'm sure you know who Enki and Enlil is, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Can you get in and talk about these characters?
Yes, absolutely. And actually, going back to something that you said before, this bipolar nature of the God of the Old Testament. Some of that comes from the fact that the stories of God in the Old Testament were copied from Sumerian stories of the two brothers Enki and Enlil, and that's why there is this sort of bipolarity in the Bible. I'll give you an example. So, in the story of Noah and the flood, right? In the story of Noah and the flood in Genesis, there's one God, and he's deciding among himself, to kill all of humanity, but then decides to save us through one family. So he's kind of having this weird bipolarity. Let's kill them all. Actually, no, let's save them through this one family. And if you're reading that for face value, you would think that, oh, okay, this is God just hesitating or whatever, or shedding mercy on us, which is cool philosophically. But the truth of the matter is the writers of the Torah were referencing a Sumerian tale known to us as the tale of Atrahasis. And I believe Atrahasis is the Babylonian version, which is the most extensive version we have. But that was copied from a Sumerian version where Atrahasis, the Noah character, is known as Ziasudra. And of course, in the Sumerian and Babylonian versions of this tale, it's not one God, but it is two gods who are deciding this matter. And the God that wants to kill us all is the god Enlil. And the God that wants to save us and ends up saving us through the protagonist Atrahasis, the Sumerian Noah, is the god Enki. And these two gods show up time and time again in ancient Anunnaki mythologies, and they are brothers, basically. And Enlil is always remembered as kind of like this vindictive, militaristic god. And his name means Lord of the Command. Enlil, Lord of the Command. And Enki, who is Lord of Earth, is always remembered as this kind of whimsical, mystical, and very knowledgeable and wise character who has an affinity towards us. And so that story of these two brothers going back and forth about killing all of us is a story that was adopted into the Old Testament. And that is why there is this bipolarity in that story.
Yeah, and Enki was the one who actually had, I guess, sympathy for mankind, because in Lil did wanted to basically dumb us down and use us as a slave race, correct?
Yeah.
Or didn't want it to,
Well,
I think he referred to as we don't want them to be as intelligent as us.
I don't know the exact phrasing from the Sumerian text, so I can't verify that, but it is clear from the stories of the flood that Enlil did want us gone, that he was annoyed of us. What I do know is that he was annoyed of us, and specifically annoyed of us because we were making noises like animals. I think is what the text says. Like we were just kind of like we were just created, and to him we were kind of like these lower beings, like we were beneath him pretty much.
Yeah, and
Yeah. Oh, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. And for someone like myself who's never really heard these stories or really like heard these names, or like where is your main source of information, or is there like these research groups that you look towards for this information, like where people can find it, I guess.
Yeah. So I got some notes here pulled up on my screen, and again, you can find some more detailed information on in my book and in the documentary. But the Sumerians were pretty much lost to the sands of time up until the 1800s. So prior to then, they were pretty much we had forgotten about them. We didn't know they existed. There was only a slight mention in the Bible, and in the Bible, they're known as the people from the land of Shinar.
Hmm.
And real quick side note, as I mentioned earlier, when I read the works of Zechariah Sitchin, which I recommend everybody doing at least as a place to start, that's when it all made sense because Zechariah Sitchin was grew up in Hebrew school. He died in 2010 at like 90 years old, and he started writing about the Anunnaki back in the 70s. Like he was the guy. So like without him, none of this would have really come to fruition, as far as the Anunnaki and ancient alien stuff. But he grew up in Hebrew school, and he always wrote about the stuff, not to like put that down the Bible, but he wrote all this stuff to bring validity to it. He was telling us, "Yo, these stories are way more complex and way more real than we could ever imagine." Um, but so again, the Bible does make mention of the Sumerians through the land of Shinar. But by the time the Bible was written around 600 BC, the Sumerian civilization had already been forgotten at that time. They fell like around 2000 BC.
Okay.
And so by the time the Bible was put together, they had already been forgotten. And actually, Ashurbanipal, one of the last kings of the Assyrian kingdom, which is about 2 to 3 major kingdoms after the Sumerians, Ashurbanipal, wrote in a tablet that we have to this day that um, he was taught by the god of writing how to read the tablets from before the flood, meaning Sumerian. So at that time, during Ashurbanipal's time, the Sumerians were like a legendary thing. Those were his like major great ancestors, So they were pretty much forgotten until the 1800s. And one of the first people to uncover the Sumerian tablets was J.S. Buckingham and Sir Henry Layard. And so these are like real scholars, like shovel in the ground excavators, explorers who were out there in the Middle East back in the 1800s digging this stuff up. So if you want some like real stuff, go check out J.S. Buckingham and Sir Henry Layard. Layard is my favorite. He's got a lot of cool books out there that you can read about his discoveries, his actual physical discoveries of Sumerian tablets. And so it kind of starts with those guys, and after them, a bunch of other people started to follow. And one of the first major discoveries that was made was actually the discovery of the city of Nineveh. And again, Nineveh is mentioned in the Bible. So again, these Torah writers knew this stuff, but it was us who didn't understand what they were speaking about. And again, it's in the Bible, and that was like the first major city we had discovered, which now corroborated the Bible. So now we were looking at the Bible differently, like, wow, so some of this stuff is real. Some of this what's in here have we uncovered yet? And so again, throughout the early 1800s and all of that, we started uncovering this stuff. And so I have a full tale on the rest of the history. But one important thing to note is since then, we've uncovered an estimation of at least 500,000 to 1,000,000 tablets, and that's coming straight from
Wow.
yeah, and that's coming straight from, I forget his name, but the head Assyriologist of the British Museum, and that's coming from him. And so we've uncovered at least 500,000 to 1,000,000 tablets, but only about 10% of them have been publicly translated. So
Hmm.
there's still a lot of stuff behind the scenes.
Yeah, and a lot of people, like I was doing a little research into Zachariah Sitchin. He was one of the few people that he claimed that could interpret ancient Sumerian. Correct?
Yeah, and that's been challenged. I don't know. I'm not gonna verify that for him, but it has
Yeah.
been challenged. But I
Well, it
mean, he
just
did
seems like
some great work for sure.
yeah, it just seems like there's a low number of people though that are able to actually interpret those tablets correctly. Maybe it's what it kind of
Yeah,
sounds like from just a little bit that I've researched.
yeah, and you can learn now. Like the forget his name, it's somewhere in here, but the main Assyriologist, of the British Museum. He's got a book. Actually, I have a book written by him somewhere on how to read Sumerian. So there's a lot more resource now on how to decipher this stuff. It just takes discipline, and
Yeah.
studying.
Now
I
with
think
all,
I think it was at UCLA or there was a couple of universities that have been actually deciphering and cataloging some of these texts. Have you heard any of that, Eddie?
Yeah, there's an online corpus catalog that I've used. What is it? It's like ECSL or Sumerian catalog. Yeah, there's a catalog, I think from Harvard, right? No, Oxford. You said Oxford Sumerian translations. Yeah, yeah, University of Oxford. They have an electronic text corpus online that you can reference. It's pretty cool. I've used it before.
And the thing for me is you have all these ancient stories and these ancient texts, and they go into you know dynamic detail of what it is that they were experiencing and dealing with, but a lot of it has just been written off as folklore or religious superstition. Or it's just to me, it's just been. I feel like it's just been ignored because I think it became very uncomfortable for people to I think it made people have to maybe ask some tough questions that people really didn't feel comfortable asking, especially in like academia or trying to take that kind of stuff on because of the controversy itself. But you have so many different cultures all around the world that they talk about their creators come from the stars. The many native cultures talk about they explain in great detail of where they come from. I think Navajo talk about star people. What is it? The Aborigines in Australia have very good detail about what star systems they were coming from. And for when you hear information like that, when they're able to literally pinpoint and talk about star clusters of where their origins came from, it makes you go, how the hell were they coming up with that kind of information? I mean, how was it that they were even able to articulate that this is where we were coming from? And not only that, but then you have cultures from all around the world that have similar star clusters that they say their origins are coming from. So I just feel like a lot of stuff in history has been completely shrugged off and ignored because I think it did challenge particular narratives, and I don't think a lot of people really had the courage to come out and challenge those narratives. But for me, it's very exciting to be able to hear people like Eddie and us to have these type of conversations, and it's happening globally to really not like I said, destroy religion at all, but it's more of let's take it to the next level and try to really pull back the layers on this and try to really understand the true essence of it all.
Yeah, man, I agree. That was one of the reasons why I set out to write my first popular book, the Lucifer Mystery Revealed, which kind of touches on this as well lightly. It does get into the Anunnaki and the story of Enoch, but I got into this to kind of deprogram and deconstruct the institutional indoctrination. I grew up in a Christian and Catholic household, and I still, for whatever reason, I still believe in Jesus Christ, and I still pray to that energy. And it's kind of a paradox for me, honestly. But it's still one of the reasons why I do what I do is to help deconstruct and deprogram the institutional indoctrination, so that we can look at all of this with an honest and mature mind. It's okay if we've been lied to. It's okay if we misunderstood history. We're still here. We're still here, and we still got here somehow. And that doesn't take away from how beautiful and miraculous all of this is. It just means we've got more studying to do, more history work to be done.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've looked at is to me all religions have been flawed in some shape or form. I mean, Christianity, or in the name of Christianity, has had some very graphic and gruesome history. The Crusades, there's been all kind of holy wars. I mean, Islam has had its issues. There's not a religion really out there for the most part that hasn't had some issues. But the common theme with all of them is a structure of good and a structure to of enlightenment. And even with Jesus, and this is my own personal interpretation of it, is I don't really think I think that he was I think Jesus was somebody that had a was the example of Christ consciousness. And Christ consciousness is a spiritual connection of deep consciousness, evolution, and being one with the universe itself. And I think that every single one of these religious figures that we've seen, whether it's Buddha or whoever, these were all people that, for whatever reason, whether it was God that had a hand in it or if it was their own spiritual evolution, these are people that I think were placed into humanity's life for guidance and to teach us that there is something bigger than what we are. I think I don't even think really Christ even was trying to really say that you need to worship me to get into heaven. I think he was trying to articulate that the embodiment of who I am and what I do, is your key to being connected to God and raising your own evolution of consciousness itself. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Eddie?
Yeah, I could definitely agree with that, man. I think if anything, on the political side of things, I think he was trying to get us to separate from the institution of church because he understood the history of the church and how it was deeply tied into these ancient polytheistic religions. And so we were just kind of following dogma in a sense, which we still kind of do around the world. And I think he was trying to break us from that. And as you said, trying to get us to understand that there is a whole other side of life outside of these earthly institutions that try to make us feel and think as if they are the authority when there's an entire universe surrounding us that was created by something entirely other than these globalists. And so, yeah, I think he was kind of like, as you said, that Christ consciousness, just here to get us to realize and wake up to the bigger picture, the much bigger picture, And I think that the God of the Bible, well, I mean, technically, the God of the Bible was just a rendition of the Anunnaki beings. And through the transition of the Anunnaki polytheism into the Judaic monotheism, we kind of shrouded that worship into like a more vague semblance, but people are still following these indoctrinated institutions, as our ancestors were thousands of years ago, who were worshiping the Anunnaki, and I could give you a more detailed example of that as I break down in my book. I think that all of monotheism, specifically the Abrahamic faiths that follow monotheism, the monotheism of the Abrahamic faiths was created specifically to control the people. And it not only was it specifically created to control the people, but it was specifically used to phase out the Anunnaki worship and kind of do away with that part of human history. And so that, and all of that, just to make it more simple, again, to just control people. Now, but before we get into understanding that, we have to understand that the Torah was written by people who understood the Anunnaki mythologies because of that came from their ancestors. Not only did they understand them, but they incorporated them into the Old Testament, the Torah. We need to understand that, and that is factual from all of the great work of the Assyriologists from the 1800s up until now. So once we understand that, then we can start to see that reflected in the Bible, for example, in the story of Noah. And probably the most profound example to me is, as you stated earlier, the example in Genesis 1:26, which is the verse that goes, and God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness." You can open up the Bible, any English Bible, and go to Genesis 1:26, and you will see the plurality there. And you can ask any theologian, priest, pastor, why the plurality is there, and they'll try to give you some theologian answer. But the reason why the plurality is there is because the original word that was used in the Hebrew text was not God, but Elohim. So when you
Elohim.
go back and you read it, it should read, and the Elohim said, let us make man in our image and after our likeness. And Elohim is a plural word, which can be translated as the powerful ones. And so now we're reading, the powerful ones said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. Now, again, if we're reading this from the perspective that the Torah writers were influenced by the Anunnaki mythologies, this makes sense because in the Sumerian tales, of which we have at least three available to us, the Anunnaki created mankind through an admixture of their blood and what is sometimes called clay in the Sumerian tales. And of course, this is again reflected in the Bible when we are told God made man out of the dust, out of the earth. So when we understand that correlation between the Anunnaki mythologies and the Torah writers, it all makes more sense. And now it gets even more crazy because the Anunnaki are mentioned in the Bible. They're mentioned in the Old Testament, just not by that name. And I'll walk you through this. So, of course, all three Abrahamic faiths were influenced by the Anunnaki tales, but it all starts with Judaism because Judaism is the original one. It starts with Judaism, then Christianity, and then Islam. But all three of those see Abraham as the patriarchal father of their religion. You know, in Christianity, Abraham is regarded as like the spiritual ancestor of the faith. And like, for example, in Paul in Romans 4:5 says that Abraham is the father of all that believe. In the Quran, in Surah 365 to 38, it is mentioned that the people who are worthiest of Abraham are those who followed him together with this prophet and the believers. So there's a major, respect for Abraham as the patriarchal father of these faiths. Now, Abraham was born in Ur Kasdim of the Chaldees. Now, there's been a bunch of scholarly articles over the centuries on who the Chaldeans were. Where is Chaldees? Now, it's generally accepted now that Chaldea is modern day Iraq. And it's interesting that the Bible says Abraham was born in Ur Kasdim of the Chaldees because the only place in that area in ancient times that was titled as Ur was literally the capital of Sumer. Sumer's capital is Ur. And interesting side note here, the temple of Ur, which still stands to this day, which Saddam Hussein was spending many millions to refurbish, was one of the first places that we had taken over during the Iraq War. You can see pictures online of our soldiers holding down the capital of Ur as a fort. And Abraham was told to leave his home and journey towards the Holy Land, right? And keep in mind, Abraham was the father of all of this. So prior to him, there was no Judaism, there was no Christianity, no Islam. He was just Abraham from Sumer. And in Joshua 24, we are told, Joshua said to all the people, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel says. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. So who were these other gods? Well, if we look at it historically, in that area prior to Judaism, the only other gods that were worshipped in that entire area were the Anunnaki. So the Bible, whenever the Bible talks about other gods, it's talking about the Anunnaki.
What do you consider to be the purpose and or motivations of the Anunnaki with their interactions with humans?
Well, me personally, I like to go to the text. There's a lot of speculation. Sitchin did a lot of speculating. And the text tell us, for example, let me see if I can pull it up here, but the text basically tell us that they created us to be servants and not necessarily like slaves, not like ball and chain slaves, but simply to serve them. They thought that we would be most happy serving them.
Yeah.
That's why they created us.
I think the mere fact that there even is an Anunnaki and that it's been recognized, I mean, how do you explain that all on its own? I mean, how could you have texts depicting gods and explaining who they were and how advanced they were. And I mean, that all on its own is an enigma by itself. How can that be? Is the real question. If the Anunnaki were real, and the texts depict that they were, that should be that should blow people's mind right then and there. But this is the point that I make when I say these type of things have been shrugged off and not even really considered. It's like you can have academia recognize it and say, yeah, these texts are real, but it's just left at that. How can you have the oldest civilization ever recorded in mankind depicting how they created us and how they operated and just can be completely written off?
Yeah, man, and that's the reason why it's been shrouded in mystery and swept under the rug. It's for that reason, because it kind of just crumbles the entire mainstream institutional narrative. Because for the first few thousand years, we worshiped these beings, and then monotheism was created, and then these beings were phased out. And through monotheism, we got the churches, we got the institutions, we got the eventual new world order, the simplified one world government, the one world systems. And so, if we start to question the origins of all this, then it all starts to crumble. Because what the church did, which Jesus Christ was attempting to deviate from, is mediate our connection to God. Jesus came here and told us that, the kingdom of God is within us. He came here to wake us up to our inner power and to our true creator, the cosmic creator.
Mm-hmm.
But the church, who killed him on all sides, took that power and that sovereignty away from us and now became the mediators between us and God. I mean, it is in history, like we were literally paying the church through the Middle Ages at some point be accepted into heaven. So now you have to go through them if you want to go
Especially
to heaven.
the Catholic Church narrative, where one of the things that always bothered me about the Catholic Church was the mere fact that you have a supreme leader, the Pope, and he's the only one who can truly communicate to God, which that disturbed me deeply, because for me there was a phrase that I once heard. It says you can tear a splinter from a piece of wood and find the kingdom of God there, and I find that to be true. That how is it, or even when the Catholic Church would what was it called, decommunicate you, or what was the terminology called, where
Excommunicate.
excommunicate you,
Hmm.
where you're no longer able to go to heaven. I have pulled the umbilical cord from you that connects you to that realm, and you're no longer going there. And it's little things like that you know that really made me question religion even more, and not question God, so to speak, that like there isn't a God. I truly do believe there is a God, and I always will. And I have little things that happen in my life that synchronicities, as I call them. And I think everybody has these type of things in their life that they can't explain. I do believe that there is a higher power. I do believe that we are connected to a God. But I think that the God that is true and real is, I think that the version that we have globally accepted here on this planet is a little bit muddied up. And I think it's a little bit more profound. I think the God that I believe in is much more profound than the one that people claim to think that they know here on this planet.
Yeah,
Oh
and
yeah.
even as like someone who is religious, I've even can see and understand why people, you know, look at these churches and go, "There's something wrong going here." I mean, you look at like Joel Osteen, his mega church, kind of what the Roman Catholics did during like the Dark Ages. They were really trying to suppress everyone's information. Like you said, with the Pope, only he has a direct contact with God, and I don't believe that either. And then I definitely feel that there are certain churches that try to take advantage of people, and they kind of stray away from what's really important. And I believe that everyone can have that intimate connection with God. Uh,
Absolutely.
and I mean, even Eddie, you research this and you still feel like you feel the spirit of God. Essentially, that's kind of what it sounded like. And I think that's I think that's awesome. I mean, that's good to hear. But it's not like you're over here shunning, people for their beliefs, or because you kind of feel it in your own and kind of still are like, well, I kind of still think this, and
Oh
that's
yeah,
okay. And I especially nowadays, we gotta stop like trying to attack each other so much and kind of be more accepting of everyone's own truths and whatnot. So that's really that was great to hear you talk about that, because I didn't hear that in the last podcast that I listened to. But
absolutely.
now, what do you see the Anunnaki as gods, as a more advanced civilization, or do you kind of think they're like on kind of the alien side of things? Like what is it that you feel they are?
So my views with them have changed over the years, and of course, when I first found them through the work of Zechariah Sitchin, I was wholly convinced that they were ancient astronauts from Planet X, Nibiru. But over the years, I've had to kind of critique Sitchin's work and look at the stuff with my own mind because it's very enticing and he
Hmm.
makes a very entertaining case. And I'm not doubting that they did come from a different planet or star system, but at this point, I have to look at this stuff through my own work.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, my conclusion is that at the very least, they were from here.
Okay.
And I think they were from here. And at the very least, they probably did have a hand in creating what is the Homo sapiens sapiens, right? Because we we are all what is considered or what are considered Homo sapiens sapiens. We are no longer Homo sapien, and so we are a newly created type of hominid creature. And what's interesting is that the Homo sapiens sapiens skeletal structure is only about 100,000 years old, and the consciousness that we operate from, the abstract version or update of consciousness that we have, is only about 50,000 years old, according to anthropologists. And there's many reasons why that is. And I talk about this in my newest book, The Crystal Lattice Mind Illusion, which is more about consciousness and stuff. And so it appears as if the Homo sapiens sapiens is a newly created hominid out of the millions of years that hominids have existed. And so when we're reading these ancient texts that tell us time and time again, we were created, specifically designed by these gods, by a mixture of their blood and clay. And then we look at the anthropology, which tells us that we are a newly designed type of hominid, not that old. It starts to make sense, you know. So what I think is
Hmm.
that these Anunnaki I think that they were survivors of a cataclysm that happened at some recent past. And the reason I think that is because of one of the oldest Sumerian texts and oldest texts known to man in general, which is the Enki and World Order text, which you can go read online. So, in the Enki and World Order text, we are told a story about Enki going around and starting civilization. He's going around, he creates the calendar, he starts domesticating animals and starts, agriculture and all these different things. And as he's going around, he starts employing certain gods like, okay, you're going to watch this, you're going to do that, this, and that. But what's interesting is in the text, there's about two occasions where it is mentioned that there are these Martu nomads, these nomads out on the outskirts, and that they have no resource, and that Enki has to give them resource because they are without resource. So I'm reading this, right? This is the oldest text known to man according to our current 7,000-year-old timeline. And this is a text about the supposed gods of creation who are very human like, very personable, who are going around doing physical work. They're not waving a magic wand around and making things grow out of the ground. No, they're physical beings doing physical work. And yet, there are these Martu nomads on the outskirts who are without resource. So, what this tells me is that the Anunnaki were survivors of some cataclysm who are not starting civilization, but restarting civilization, and that these Martu nomads are disenfranchised people who weren't savvy enough or fortunate enough to have the technology or the means to recreate society and civilization as the Anunnaki had. And further than that, I think that the Anunnaki, whoever they really were wise enough and I guess arrogant enough to rewrite themselves in the history of humanity as the gods.
Wow.
Well, I would like to. Obviously, I think there's plenty of things within the Bible and ancient texts that kind of have evidence of possible extraterrestrial activity and technology. Is there anything particular that you guys could think of, like for example, like we could do Ezekiel, or even Jonah being swallowed by a whale? I mean, clearly, like some of these things seem to indicate some type of technology. Ezekiel talked about interacting with beings that came down, and what he described a wheel within a wheel. Jonah being swallowed by a whale. Well, we know that's completely impossible for him to be swallowed by a whale. But I think he also talked about it having brass ribs or metal ribs. So it almost seems like that interaction wasn't, obviously him interacting with a whale and being swallowed, but I think he was trying to articulate something that happened to him that he couldn't quite explain. Eddie, is
Like
there
a
is
submarine or something, maybe?
exactly? I mean, was he taken up into a ship? I mean, what was? I mean, clearly he wasn't swallowed by a whale.
Yeah.
And the way he articulates it makes it even more clear it wasn't a whale. But what things in the Bible do you think, or ancient texts, seem to indicate possible technology rather than spiritual interaction?
When it comes to technology, I really love the story of Enoch, and specifically the story as it's told through the Apocrypha. I think there's a lot there, and I write about it in both the Lucifer book and the Anunnaki book. And that story is powerful because it's also another one of these stories that was swept under the rug. In some cases, what it seems like deliberately, because that story eventually leads back to the Anunnaki history. Excuse me. And so the story of Enoch, we're told the story of Enoch in a very short form in the book of Genesis. All that we're told is that Enoch was, I believe, like the great grandfather of Noah, and that he walked with the Lord. That's all we know, is that he was a great grandfather of Noah, and he was one of the few people, including Elijah, who were absolved of death, physical death, and who were directly taken to heaven to be with God. That's all we know from the Bible. But there's an apocryphal book, the books of Enoch, outside of the Bible, which were highly circulated the first few centuries before the Common Era and the first few centuries after the Common Era. And that book, the apocryphal book of Enoch, goes into way more detail about the story of this great grandfather of Noah. And that story, that book, is reflected and quoted many times in the New Testament. The book of Jude directly quotes from the book of Enoch by name. And so there's a lot of evidences that the book of Enoch was very profound and highly respected by the early Christian writers and Christians in general, and even some of the Jewish and the Hellenistic Jews. So if you get both best of both worlds, some of the Jews, a lot of the Jews respected the book of Enoch, and a lot of the Christians respected the book of Enoch. But at the same time, a lot of Jews disrespected the book of Enoch because it was too Christian. It was too like mystical Christian. And a lot of the early Christian people disrespected the book of Enoch because it was too Judaic. It was kind of in the mix of both. But in the apocryphal books of Enoch, we are told that at some point he was, as you can say, abducted by some angels. some angels swooped down, took him up, and showed him the secrets of heaven and earth and the stars and all the stuff. And it's a fascinating read. I mean, it sounds as if he's in some craft, and he's being shown all these different things that he can only describe as lights and crystals and fire and this, and that. But he could be talking about some very highly advanced, really cool technology. And
I think
so,
he even described what the world looked like from the heavens. Correct. I think
yeah,
he saw Earth.
yeah. It kind of got smaller and smaller as he went up. And some people try to use it as like evidence for the flat Earth, I believe. But yeah, I mean, you can't see the Earth that high up without being in some kind of craft or something.
Y-
So
Yeah, you could look at Revelations too, kind of that experience that John had, at the throne of God. I mean, what he described was nothing of this earth. And not only that, but he saw all these different creatures, the seraphim, how crazy they kind of look, and then on top of that, you kind of have like four living creatures, which are these humanoid bodies with animal heads. So, I mean, yeah, there's some pretty interesting stuff in the Bible that kind of point to things that we do not experience here on Earth at all.
And I think a
yeah,
lot of it also is, I think we're gonna. What I'd like to hope is we're gonna find out that there really isn't. I don't think there's going to be this separation between religion and reality. I think humanity is gonna come to grips as we evolve our own consciousness and awareness. That we're going to start realizing that our world is much stranger, our reality is much more stranger and more complex than we can even fathom. And I think eventually we're going to realize that maybe a lot of this stuff goes hand in hand. Maybe religion or God and all these things combined aren't really separated from one another, that we're eventually going to start roping all this in together and realizing it's all a part of the same thing. That's what I tend to believe. Like who knows if extraterrestrials, if they are a part of religion, spirituality. What if this is all just bundled up together and we just can't quite comprehend it yet?
yeah, man. I think so. I always like to say, there's one human family, there's one history, there's just different perspectives. There was a beginning, and there's the present. It's just one timeline, one family, one history, but we're all just telling our own versions of it. And so there had to be a beginning, and there had to be a creator. And yeah, I think that as I say in my newest book, it's life, and all of this is way more fascinating than these tales of the Anunnaki. Even I view them as kind of just our elder brothers and sisters of the past, who were flawed, who were very flawed, and we kind of inhabited a lot of their flaws, and that is reflected in the Sumerian tales. And so I think that they were a part of the creator's plan. They were a part of the bigger story, and we've inherited a lot of their trauma and a lot of their bad habits. But eventually, I think Christ was trying to get us to wake up and move away from the physical, carnal history of humanity and get us to start thinking more on the spiritual side so that we can start evolving in that way. And it's interesting, too, how the Garden of Eden, the beginning of all of this, as they say, the number one sin was eating the forbidden fruit of knowledge. So it's like from the get-go, they didn't want us to become self-aware. They didn't want us to become self-sufficient. But unfortunately, they lost grips of us, and they had their own downfall, and we were given sovereignty over ourselves and over this earth. And we haven't been doing a good job, I would say, the past several hundred years, but we're getting there.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the Garden of Eden, because in that storyline, it was the serpent that was demonized. But in other cultures, the serpent is a sign of deep, profound knowledge. And it's interesting that that serpent was involved with this, with mankind falling out of heaven. I think there's a little bit more to that story about the serpent being demonized and what that truly meant.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So again, if we're reading the Torah from the perspective that these people were writing, these writers were influenced by the Sumerian tales, it's kind of clear as to who they were speaking about in that story. So the word that is used in the Garden of Eden story isn't serpent, of course. In the Hebrew, the word that is used is nakash. And nakash is kind of one of those playful words that the Old Testament uses throughout. And Nakash can either mean serpent or wise one. So it was
Mhm.
telling us it was a wise one or a serpent. Now, in all Sumerian or all Anunnaki mythology, the only person that is consistently referred to as a wise serpent is Enki. And so again, we're seeing Enki reflected here. We're seeing the two brothers reflected here. When we're told in the Bible that, God was angry at us, and there was this other serpent being who wanted to give us knowledge. That confliction again is just a summarized version of the confliction between Enki and Enlil. So in this case, Enlil would be playing the part of God who kicked us out of the Garden of Eden, and Enki would be playing the role of the serpent who wanted to give his creations some knowledge. He adored us, admired us, and thought that we could maybe be more than just these biological AI servants.
And how did you, what are your thoughts on, I mean, the devil? Is the devil real? What does the devil truly stand for? Is the devil or Satan, was that something that you believe that was created by religion itself to have a straw man, a bad guy, or was this a real person? Even demons. How would you really kind of define that?
Well, it's a complex situation, honestly, and there's different layers here, and hundreds of years that led to the creation, the archetypal creation of Satan. Let's start with that one. So, in the earliest of Hebrew texts, the earliest of Jewish texts, Satan is always used as a lowercase. It's always Ha Satan, the Satan. But Hasatan is always referring to any being, any being, whether human or divine, who is an instigator or basically, yes, an instigator. So that would be a Hasatan, a Satan. And specifically in the story of Job, Satan is this character who's kind of trying to instigate Job. He's because that's his role. It's
Yep.
Satan's role to instigate, to test us. But later on in Jewish history, primarily through the early Christian years, Hasatan as a lowercase became uppercase Satan. So it slowly just moved into like a more archetypal, embodied figure of evil. That's one layer of it. That's the layer of the etymological progression and conceptual progression of who he was. But the the writers of the Torah came together and created the Old Testament during the Babylonian captivity of around 600 BC. This was a real occurrence in history. But when the Babylonians descended upon the kingdom of Judah and took them into captivity, they only took the elite. They left behind all the common folk. That was part of their custom. So you have the elite of the Israelites living in Babylon for some time during the captivity. And now they're being influenced by the Babylonians. And they're kind of picking up little things, some things here and there. And later on, King Cyrus, the Persian, dispelled the Babylonians. He became victorious and drew them away. And now he became the ruler of all of the Levant, the Middle East area. And luckily for the Jews, King Cyrus was tolerant towards all other religions, and he gave them a choice. He said, you can go back or you can stay here. Some of them went back, some of them stayed, and the ones who stayed began, or the ones who started the Babylonian priesthood and wrote the Babylonian Talmud and so on. But what's important about that is the state religion of the Persian Empire under King Cyrus was Zoroastrianism. Now, Zoroastrianism can actually be argued, it can be argued that Zoroastrianism is the actual first monotheistic religion. But that's a whole other thing, and I get into that in my books as well. But Zoroaster and Zoroastrianism is very interesting and intriguing, and it is obvious to many, many scholars over the centuries that early Judaism was influenced by Zoroastrianism. And what's interesting is that Zoroastrianism is one of the first religions way before Judaism that tells us about two opposing powers. And these two opposing powers are Ahura Mazda, the god of light, the god of wisdom, and Angra Mainyu. I forget what that translates into. And also in Zoroastrianism, we're told about a Messiah figure who is supposed to come in the future. And we're told about a doomsday, an apocalypse with a day of judgment. All of this coming out of Zoroastrianism thousands of years before Christianity and almost 2,000 years before Judaism. And so a lot of scholars have speculated that the idea of this opposing figure to God, this Satan figure, was actually influenced from Zoroastrianism.
Very interesting. I mean, what's your take on Satan and demons, Christian?
Well, I mean, obviously, I kind of believe it. I believe the Bible for what it says. I think it's pretty interesting the commonality between the two. You know, it's almost, if you want to believe like there was this one story and maybe just over time it's been kind of misconstrued. But yeah, I mean, I believe that he was an angel of God, and you know, he kind of turned against God, and then God banished him, and you know, I think it was like one third of the angels that followed him to the earth, and then you know, those angels kind of are like what we would perceive as like demons now, and then Satan kind of, you know, is in this realm rather than in the realm of heaven. And it in the Bible they even talk about that he still has powers, because like you said, you mentioned in Job, you know, he pretty much tortured that guy, you know, and it was like a conversation that him and God had to see, you know, would Job break his faith and kind of lose faith in God. And you know, obviously as the story goes that he didn't, but it still shows that Satan was he still has the ability to control or affect people on this earth. And you know, and I still believe that that can be true, and that demons do exist, or you know, these evil spiritual entities. But yeah, I mean, it's mostly just exactly how it would go in the Bible, obviously. But um I am kind of curious of like why this information that you know, Eddie, why it is so suppressed. And like I wonder if there's like a reason to to suppress that, you know, because you know, just because you put it out there, not everyone's gonna follow it or believe it. But it does seem like they really push to not even have these stories be known at all, or even be like thought about.
Yeah, well, for me, most of it is like human error. The suppression comes in the harsh treatment that the church has given people who have tried to question them. I
Hmm.
think for the most part, the church was mostly just suppressing people's sovereignty. You know, they just didn't want us to be sovereign.
Hmm.
And I'll give you an example. So, and the Bible tells us this. So the Bible tells us that during the Babylon or after the Babylonian captivity, or sorry, hold up. The Bible tells us prior to the Babylonian captivity that the people of Judah were losing their way. And I believe it's in Jeremiah where it is told, where we are told that before the Babylonians descended and took them into captivity, that the people were reverting back to the ways of their ancestors and worshiping as many gods as there were in the worship of the Anunnaki. And after the Babylonian captivity, whoever it was, and we still don't know who, these elite got together and put together the Bible. But we're told in the Bible that Artaxerxes, one of the rulers after Cyrus, employed the Jewish royal prophet Ezra to go back to the kingdom of Judah and bring a new law to their people. So we're told that Ezra and Nehemiah were the two responsible for going back to the kingdom of Judah to implement the new law, the Torah, and specifically to to unify the people, and it could be argued to control the people, because at that time they were losing their way. They were becoming all polytheistic. And so the elite were wise enough to say, well, look, we already got taken over by the Babylonians once, and we weren't strong enough and unified enough to stand against that. So we need some sort of unification. And that unification was the Torah. It was monotheism, but it was specifically designed for that reason. And later on, Christianity followed the same blueprint, because at that time, during the Roman Empire, it was the same thing. All the people were very loose with their religions. They were still pagans. There were Christians. This is or not Christians. Sorry, there were just a bunch of pagans, worshiping these different gods. And
Yeah.
so they put their foot down and said, no more paganism, none of this stuff. They simplified it: one religion, one state, one rule. And all that did was just kind of shovel us into a situation where the government and the church were the mediators between us and our personal connection with God.
Yeah, and I feel like, especially after the Romans embraced Christianity, I feel like that's when they realized they could get a power handle on people. And I think it's extremely complex. I don't think it's really like a plot at the end of the day that people were like, we have to suppress this. I think it's extremely complex. But I also think that keeping that type of information suppressed keeps people's minds in a box. If it's not broke, don't fix it. That old philosophy. And I think the mere fact that any discussions like this have never really taken place for the most part is because discussions like this open up people's minds. It sparks curiosity. It sparks a wanting to know. There was actually, I have it on my phone. It was going to be one of my favorite phrases. I wanted to actually get this tattooed on me. It's Matthew, forgive me, I'm not sure which one it actually is, but it's, to him who knocks and keeps knocking, the door will be opened. And I loved that so much, because to me, the way that I interpreted that is that means if you have a curiosity and you keep having that curiosity and a desire to learn, you will get the answers eventually. And I think that's extremely powerful. And I think it's also very important that people are able to have these type of conversations. And it shouldn't be something of a stigma to question this. Even people of faith, I think it should be okay to be able to just have a conversation and try to understand this better, because really at the end of the day, I don't think anybody really has it figured out. And I don't think we ever will have it figured out unless we have conversations like this.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and I can give you another pretty in-depth example as to how some of this was hidden, either due to human error or a deliberate action, if you'd like.
Sure.
Yeah.
So this one takes a little more explanation. So bear with me here, and it's been a while since I've broken this down. But there's a strange mention in 1 Peter 3:18 through 20 about Christ supposedly going to hell. And I'll break that down as well. And this verse has been regarded by some as the strangest verse in the entire Bible. So if you go to 1 Peter 3:18 through 20, you'll find this strange account of Christ's spirit going to a prison and preaching to the disobedient spirits of Noah's time. And this is and according to even Christianity.com, this is the most cited Bible passage for the account of Jesus descending to hell before his resurrection. So there's this whole thing told in Christianity that Jesus went to hell to redeem our souls. He didn't go to a hell, he went to a prison. And this verse has baffled theologians for many, many centuries. For
Yeah,
example,
definitely.
for example, in a thesis submitted in 2002 to Liberty University for a degree in Masters of Arts by a Jason M. Houff, titled "Interpretation of 1 Peter 3:18 through 22." He says, the exegesis of this verse is a seemingly endless labyrinth of closely knit problems that has puzzled and motivated many. All who have attempted to unravel its secrets have soon realized that it is a notoriously difficult passage to interpret. And he wasn't the only one who made that conclusion. Even the famous Martin Luther stated, and I quote, that this is a wonderful text and a more obscure passage perhaps than any other in the Testament, so that I do not know for a certainty just what Peter means. I cannot understand and I cannot explain it. And there has been no one who has explained it. And I'm not claiming to be the one who can explain it, but I will present some facts that might help us out here.
Yeah, I actually just took a course through the New Testament. Kind of goes like deep dives into it at my college, and we actually not that long ago just kind of briefly went over this text, and that yeah, it's kind of interesting that you brought it up because it is shrouded in such mystery, and everything you said is really exactly what we talked about in class. So it's really, really interesting.
Hello?
Yep.
Oh, sorry. I think you kind of froze there. Well, that's actually really cool. Actually, I'd be interested to hear like what they taught you first before I get into it. I think that'd be an interesting contrast.
I mean, like you said, it's kind of shrouded in mystery. We didn't really go into great detail about it. That wasn't really the main focus of our class that day. And even our instructor was kind of like, we could talk about this for a long time. Obviously, we have time constriction with class, but
Yeah.
we talked. He mentioned it, and he really kind of coincided with what you just said about it, how in depth it is, how strange it is, how all these scholars really don't understand, you know, what it means. Even talked about Martin Luther, So I mean, like, it's just really interesting that you brought that up because I think a lot of people skip over that, or they just because they don't really know exactly how to go into it. So
Oh yeah. He was like, we're just gonna leave that one there. Let's move along.
yeah,
Yeah. Nothing to see here.
Oh,
Let's just go.
yeah. I mean, no,
well,
I mean, what
dude.
like don't pay attention to this, but it was he was just like, if y'all really want to kind of deep dive into something, check this out, look into this a lot more. Like I
And
said,
see,
he kind of
I've never even heard that, so I find it extremely fascinating because this is the first time I've actually even heard that.
yeah. But anyways, you can go on, Eddie. I'm kind of curious to
For
hear
sure,
your
man.
thoughts.
Well, you're gonna go to class the next day and you're gonna have the answer, dude. You're like, I
Get
found
some extra
out.
credit.
Yeah. All right. So
So
we
yeah,
know
give us
it's
your take on it.
absolutely so we know it's very strange. And so let's just read it for what it is. So we are told in those verses in 1 Peter 3:18 through 22, we're basically told that Christ suffered for sins for the just for the unjust, that he may bring us to God. And then verse 19 is where the confusion begins. By which also he went and preached unto the spirits in prison. Just that alone has stumbled people for so many years, and it's going to get really weird now, and you'll see. So the questions that theologians have struggled with is for centuries are who are these spirits in the prison? Where is the prison located? What did Christ actually proclaim? And when did this preaching take place? We're told that Christ died and he suffered, he died, and then by which he also went and preached to these spirits in prison. So in the original Greek, the opening verse of 19 is sometimes translated as by which or in which. But initially in the Greek, it is read enokai, Enokai, which is really close to Enoch in Greek, which is Enox. Now, if we add a Greek chi to enokai, in which also transforms into and Enoch. So the context here, because this verse makes no sense. It makes no sense. It's as if something is missing, some context is missing. And the
Yeah.
first scholar to translate the original Greek manuscript words of 1 Peter from Christ to Enoch, the first scholar who realized that there might have been an error in the translation was a guy by the name of William Bowyer from 1772. And this is fascinating because this was even before the Book of Enoch was brought to English readers. The Book of Enoch was discovered and brought to the Western world many years after this. So he was wise enough to look at this and realize that there's some context missing, and it might have been in the Greek mistranslation of Enokai to Enochkai. I don't know how to say it, but from in which to and Enoch. So we translated it as by which or in which, but it should originally, as some people say, been translated as and in which or by which Enoch.
Hmm.
And so what we're reading now, or before I get into what that means, another scholar from 1891 by the name of J.R. Harris wrote in an essay titled A Further Note on the Use of Enoch in 1 Peter that these imprisoned spirits are the angels who sinned with mortal women, for whose offense and its punishment the book of Enoch is our prime authority. The very language used in Enoch for their place of punishment, this place is the prison of the angels, is in close correspondence with the Petrine expression. Perhaps, after all, the difficulty really arises from the fact that the subject of the word Enoch has dropped out of the text, and that the real person who made proclamation to the spirits in prison is not Christ, but Enoch himself. So, if we go back and read it, right, it says that Christ died, and then Christ died for the just for the unjust. Where is it? Trying to find here. So Christ died, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, by which also he went and preached unto the spirits. But the way we should be reading it is, Christ died or suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, in which also Enoch went and preached unto the spirits in prison. So what Peter is saying is that the same way that Christ transitioned, the same way that Christ transitioned into the spirit realm, Enoch also transitioned and was led to the spirits in this prison. That's what he's saying. He's comparing the two. He's saying what Christ did was similar in the way that Enoch went and preached to the spirits in the prison. Now, that might be like, okay, whatever, right? But the interesting thing is that there was actually a deliberate action by a lot of the early Christian leaders, for example, like Jerome and several other writers that I can pull up in a second, who were trying to scrub out the story of Enoch because they thought it was a very strange story. Because in the story of Enoch, angels and demons are corporeal beings. And in the story of Enoch, these corporeal angels or demons have sex with human women.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what created the sons of gods in the book of Genesis. And so the early Christian writers didn't like that. They were conflicted with that. How
would these be the Nephilim, or is that different?
These are the people who created the Nephilim.
Oh, okay.
The Nephilim were born out of the sex between angels and humans. The sons of God. And in the Bible, we are told the sons of God mated with human women, and then the Nephilim were born.
Even that alone by itself, just think about that for a second. So you're saying, or they're saying, the sons of God mated with human women and created these flesh, blood beings. When you really try to wrap your mind around that, that doesn't sound like it's necessarily something that was a spiritual being that was having sex with a female human. That sounds like a flesh and blood being that inseminated a female being from this planet. It's little things like that when you look at that and try to like dissect that and make sense out of it. That raises questions all by itself with who are they really dealing with?
Oh yeah. Yep. So in this very strange verse in Peter, The context that is missing there, that has baffled scientists forever, is the context of Enoch going to preach to the spirits in prison, which is what the entire book of Enoch is. If you go and read the books of Enoch, he's abducted by the good angels, and they show him a prison where some of these bad angels are being held. And
Hmm.
so Peter is telling us what Christ did for us is similar to what Enoch did, because what Enoch does in the story is he goes and he preaches to these spirits in prison, and he tells them that they face their judgment on the day of judgment. And so it's a comparison. And again, these early Christian fathers, as called, as Jerome, and Augustine and many others, did not like the book of Enoch because of this corporeal sex between angels and humans. And as you just pointed out, Mike, who were these angels and that were having sex with us? Well, again, if we go back and look at all of this through the perspective that the writers of the Torah were influenced by their ancestors, the Sumerians, then these beings are none other than the Anunnaki.
Just
Wow.
absolutely fascinating. One of the things I also wanted to mention too is, I think there's a lot of religions out there that are kind of point blank about what they're describing as far as interacting with beings and even technology. For example, I mean, the ancient Vedas were very specific about some of their interactions with these beings. The ancient Vedas talked about Vimanas, and they point blank describe them as flying craft, and they go into specific detail of how these craft operate. There's actually, like, if you look them up, the Vedas, and you can actually see some of the diagrams of actually how they've described how these craft worked and operated. It's pretty mind blowing when you hear that, and they talk about wars in these craft and they describe the weaponry of how these craft, the weaponry that these craft deployed. I think there's one particular scene in the butcher the name of this, the Mahabharata. What was it called?
The Mahabharata.
That's it. I always butcher that term, but they talk about a war in that book, and they describe the war like in vivid detail, talking about how elephants are on fire. It's almost like they're describing a nuclear explosion. It ends with a nuclear explosion, and they describe other weaponry like flames coming down from these chariots in the sky. One of the interesting things that kind of validates that, I think it's recently in Pakistan, they started finding high levels of radiation in a particular place in Pakistan, I do believe. And the only way that level of radiation could even exist would have to be through nuclear activity. They can even, where this particular radiation levels are at, they're actually seeing fused sand that's created glass. And only it would take, there was nothing that could create heat of that caliber that could fuse the sand and turn it into glass like it did. It's not like they're using fire technology to craft glass. This is in the landscape itself. So it's impossible for a fire, so to speak, to be able to fuse this glass into the landscape. So that was a really interesting story that kind of validates this war that they depict in their religious book.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I know, I'm familiar with what you're talking about. Sitchin talks about that as well in his books. And yeah, man, in my Anunnaki book, I kind of go through all these different evidences or correlations between the Sumerian myths and the Bible. And Sitchin, he talks about that place and he correlates it with the Sodom and Gomorrah story. You know how in Sodom and Gomorrah, God rained down fire and brimstone on the cities, and he believes that that place is one of the remnants of that story. You know that whatever it was, God nuked these cities, and that's just like the remnants of that nuking. But it's interesting that that story is very interesting, and I pick it apart in my Anunnaki book. This story of Sodom and Gomorrah, because again, it's not. If you go back and read it, it's not God that comes down and talks to um, Abraham and his nephew Lot, it's at least 2 to 3 angels. There's 2 to 3 angels who show up like Jedis or something, and as soon as they see them, they know they're like holy men, they can
Yeah.
identify them. They like get down on their knees like, oh man, like, so it's like these weird, yeah, like these, it's not God, it's these different angels. And so I break that down in my book as how these are, again, the Anunnaki showing up in the Bible.
And even in the Bhagavad Gita, it's not this war isn't even it's not war against humans. It's these beings having a war with each other for some type of domination over humanity. I mean, that's kind of correct on that, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, pretty much. I mean, all even in just Sumerian history, and I break this down in my book too and documentary. Even the history of the Sumerians is riddled with war. They were never a unified kingdom. They were always city states warring against each other, and they were always warring, at the behest of their gods. It's always like this god versus that god versus that god. So we've always been warring against each other, for our gods.
And even when you get into like Greek mythology, I mean, I don't think that these are necessarily characters that they made up. I think there has to be some type of connection to the origin of these beings and these gods. I mean, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it all in one way or another kind of leads us back to the Anunnaki, because for the first few thousand years of our current timeline, we were worshiping these beings. Some scholars date Abraham's legendary lifetime as being next to the lifetime of Hammurabi. A lot of scholars say that Abraham was alive at the same time of Hammurabi, and so that was like 1400 BC. And if that's true, what's interesting is if you go back and read Hammurabi's famous law codes, he starts it off by praising the Anunnaki by that name. He praises the Anunnaki, Anu and Enlil and Marduk. So even at Abraham's time, these gods were still being worshipped by name. So they are deeply rooted into our subpsyche, into our entire mythology as human beings on this earth. And that story has just been retold by different cultures that came afterward.
Well, I think we're getting pretty close to wrapping this up, but I want to recap with you guys, like, how important do you think it is to be able to have these type of conversations, to be able to, you know, be curious about what our religions truly mean, and who they were really interacting with. For deeply religious people, I would hope that you would find some type of comfort in being able to at least kind of look into it and maybe just question things without feeling like you're doing something wrong. Because I feel like all things should be questioned to a degree. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's breaking your faith or whatnot. But how important do you guys feel like it is to be able that we're sitting here together, all three of us, having this conversation?
I think it's incredibly important. I mean, it's healthy too. I mean, it seems like nowadays everyone's just like so quick to like shut other ideas down or like beliefs or if it be religious or political. It's just like if this person doesn't believe exactly what I believe, it's almost like a violent interaction nowadays. It's a very hostile environment to disagree with somebody, and I just think it's just not healthy. That's not healthy for a person individually and us as a society. It's just gonna stuff like that's just gonna tear us further apart. So I just think like the practice of being able to listen to other people's thoughts and beliefs, even if it goes completely against what you believe, you don't have to come at them, with violence or hostility. There's no reason, as long as like everyone's really respectful of each other, then I don't really see it being a problem at all. And I just think that unfortunately our society right now has kind of like lost their way in that sense.
Agreed, man. Definitely. Yeah, I think it's imperative. I think it's imperative to our conscious elevation and progression. So I think guys like us would have been put to the guillotine, back in the
Yeah.
day.
Or burned
S
alive.
Yeah. So that right there tells you, what we're doing is important, and I think it's cool that we're continuing it.
Yeah, and I think clearly there's a lot of issues in the world, and depending on where you're at in the world, there's a religion is attached to that. So I think there's probably right now is probably the best time to circle back around and try to better understand these things, and maybe we can fix the world while we're at it.
Eddie, a quick question. Have you like kind of faced any backlash or like pressure from anyone about this kind of information you're kind of putting out there?
Nothing major,
Hmm.
nothing major, just internet trolls more than anything really,
Yeah,
but nothing that I pay attention to really,
that's good.
you
That's
know.
good.
Yeah.
Well, Eddie, if people want to learn more about you, how can people get a hold of you and find your work?
You can find me on Instagram at Esoteric Eddie. I post a lot of content on there and also some behind the scenes of just my daily life as well. You can find all my books and some other cool stuff at esotericeddie.com. Find all my documentaries and videos on YouTube at Esoteric Eddie TV.
All right. Well,
Awesome.
I think that's gonna wrap it up for us. Well, thanks so much, guys, and I appreciate having all of you here for another episode Behind the Veil. And Eddie, hope to talk to you again in the near future on some other amazing topics.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thank y'all for listening.